Bismillah, in this stream, we'll look at Zephaniah chapter 3's prophecy of the Muslims. So this is the key verse. I'm going to start with that, and then we'll zoom out and look at the passage as a whole. So the key verse is verse 9. For then I will give to the peoples purified lips, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord to serve him with one shoulder. And you can see that the New American Standard Bible has interpreted that as meaning shoulder to shoulder. They're going to serve him shoulder to shoulder. Here's another translation. For then, changing their impure language, I will give to the people a clear and pure speech from pure lips, that they may call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one unanimous consent and one united shoulder bearing the yoke of the Lord. So here's the Hebrew. For then I will restore, or I will change to the nations, the peoples. The next word can be understood as language, right? Or tongue or lips, you can see here, sorry. So they have it as lips. So either as lips or understanding that to mean language. So I will change the people to purified lips or purified language, so that they may call all of them upon the name of the divine name, the Lord, to serve him with one shoulder. That's the Hebrew. Okay. And many understand that the meaning of one shoulder is that they're going to serve him shoulder to shoulder, right? And others say it refers to unity. And as for the purified lips, some say it refers to a pure language, and others say to monotheism, that they're going to stop calling upon their idols and they're going to call upon the one God. And you can see all these different interpretations actually complement each other. They go nicely with each other. So how is Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 9 fulfilled? Well, the Muslims, as we see here, they pray in Arabic. So God changed the people's language to a pure language, the pure language of Arabic, so that they may call upon the name of the Lord. And the Muslims, they use this language, Arabic, in their prayers to call upon the Lord, and they serve him with one shoulder, because when the Muslims pray together, they pray in a congregation. Their prayers, their 5 prayers, are held in congregation, where the Muslims line up shoulder to shoulder, and they follow the leader of the prayer. When he bows, they bow. When he rises up, they rise. When he prostrates, they prostrate. So it's as if they're one body, they're one shoulder, all of them together, lined up shoulder to shoulder and following the imam in front of them as if they were all one body. Okay, so that is how Zephaniah chapter 3 was fulfilled, with the language being given to the nations, the Gentiles of Arabic, by which they pray to God, and the congregational prayers, in which they pray in Arabic, of course. They pray as if they are one shoulder, right? Shoulder to shoulder lined up, and all of them praying as if they're one body. So having looked at that key verse, now we can zoom out, and look at the passage as a whole. So the passage has 3 sections, or subsections, you could say. You have verse 8, then you have verses 9 to 10, and then you have verse 11. So verse 8 is about judgment on the nations. Okay, and then verse 9 to 10, now the nations have converted and begun to worship the one God. So obviously there's a time jump here, right? First, the nations are punished. Then, obviously, the implication is at a later time, the nations are going to worship the one God. And then verse 11 onwards then starts to speak about Judah and Israel, their restoration. Right? And it begins with the phrase "on that day," which often is a transition phrase. So verse 8, punishment on the nations, then a transition to now the nations have begun to worship the one God. And then verse 11, the topic switches, and now it's about the restoration of Israel. Okay. So having understood the general frame of the passage, let's go into more detail, starting with verse 8. Therefore, wait for me, says the Lord, for the day when I arise as a witness. For my decision is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, to pour out upon them my indignation, all the heat of my anger. For in the fire of my passion, all the earth shall be consumed. So, what does it mean to gather the nations? As this commentary points out, It's not implied that the nations are going to be gathered to Jerusalem to be judged. Rather, the gathering just expresses the idea that they shall be universally and simultaneously judged. Okay, and the International Critical Commentary says the same thing. For it is my decision to gather nations. This is not a word here about gathering them to or against Jerusalem, nor is it necessary to suppose that such a thought was in the writer's mind. The gathering merely expresses the idea that they shall all be universally and simultaneously judged. Sort of like Isaiah 13, which says, "Listen, a tumult on the mountains, as of a great multitude. Listen, an uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathering together. The Lord of hosts is mustering an army for battle." So there, in Isaiah, the idea seems to be the gathering of nations for war. Zephaniah just seems to be sort of a rhetorical way to say that God is going to judge the nations, like we have in Ezekiel, where God says, "As one gathers silver, bronze, iron, lead, and tin into a smelter to blow the fire upon them in order to melt them, so I will gather you in my anger and my wrath, and I will put you in and melt you. I will gather you and blow upon you with the fire of my wrath, and you shall be melted within it," etc. So here the punishment on Israel being described as if they're gathered together in a pot, but of course they weren't literally gathered. That's not the sense that Ezekiel is using. It's just using this as a way to express that they're going to be judged. So that is how Zephaniah is using this idea of gathering. Basically, the idea is the nations are going to be judged by God. Okay. And if you look throughout Zephaniah, by the way, you'll see a lot of hyperbole. For example, Zephaniah chapter 1, it speaks as if all of creation is going to be undone, right? But that's just metaphorical language to express the idea of military conquest and punishment that's going to come. Okay. Uh, okay, I think we have something sort of in the middle between the nations gathering to Jerusalem and then this sort of hyper stylized idea in Joel 3, where it says that I will gather all nations and bring them to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Now, obviously, that's not literally going to happen that all the nations are going to come, but to me, it seems the idea that an army of nations are going to come there, or some nations are going to come there, but not exactly in a fully literal sense that all the nations are going to come to some valley. Like that doesn't make sense. You can't have all the nations, gathering in one valley. That's not the point. So Marvin Sweeney, he mentions the idea of gathering. Okay, the verbs to gather, to assemble, may be used in the general sense of assembling people for any particular purpose. The terms may also be used in relation to the harvesting, gathering, or collection of agricultural produce and other forms of material gain, such as booty, money, and so on. They may be used to describe the assembly for battle, destruction, or judgment. Indeed, the following references to the Lord's wrath, anger, and zeal clearly indicate that the nations are to be judged and punished in this sense. The use of the verb points back to the Lord's initial statement of the book, "I will surely gather all from upon the face of the earth. I will gather humans and animals. I will gather the birds of the heavens and the fishes of the sea." This is, of course, is in keeping with the general perspective of the oracles concerning the nations in the book. Okay. So the point being, God is going to judge the nations. Now, what's that a reference to? How is it fulfilled? Well, one possibility is it's a reference to the Islamic conquests. As we know, Muslims went out and conquered many nations, and hence punishing them, right, in this jihad form. Some propose that the judgment is a reference to the Babylonian Empire that came and conquered the nations. This is possible as well, but I would say that the interpretation that this is about the Islamic conquests makes more sense, because in verse 9 there's the transition, and now the Gentiles have begun to worship the one God. So that better fits the Islamic conquest, because the Gentiles beginning to worship the one God was a result of the Muslim conquests, not the Babylonian conquests. But we should keep in mind that in Zephaniah chapter 2, it says, "The Lord will be terrible against them. He will shrivel all the gods of the earth, and to him shall bow down each in its place all the coasts and islands of the nations." So here, seemingly, we have the Babylonian judgment, and after that, the Gentiles in the world have begun to worship the one God. And obviously, the part about the Gentiles worshiping the one God would also be fulfilled in Islam here in Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 11. Okay. So, the Babylonian interpretation is mentioned here. This is the New Collegeville commentary. And this is just mentioning on Zephaniah in general. The historical backdrop to Zephaniah's preaching is the invasion of the Babylonians, whom God is raising up as Judah's enemy to chastise Judah for its transgressions. The Oxford Handbook of the Minor Prophets under Zephaniah, which is chapter 37, they write, the processes that produce the Book of the 12 continue to provoke discussion, but notably, Zephaniah's location between Nahum to Habakkuk and Haggai gives it a unique importance as it ends the pre-exilic period and precedes the exile. Zephaniah's message of judgment literally leads to the exile, and its message of restoration is followed by the return and rebuilding of the temple seen in Haggai and Zechariah. In this context, Zephaniah's similarities with earlier prophetic books brings their content toward a new literary and historical horizon where previously proclaimed judgment would be fulfilled in the exile. Zephaniah's intertextual allusions to earlier books not only address the people of his time but serve to confirm the truth of his predecessors. Basically, the position of the book of Zephaniah in the book of the minor prophets, the 12 minor prophets, indicates that this book was understood as foretelling the Babylonian exile. Okay, that's how the people who put together the order of the Book of the 12 understood it. Marvin Sweeney says the same thing. Clearly, the position of Zephaniah in both the Masoretic and Septuagint versions of the Book of the 12 indicates that the book can be read in relation to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. Okay. And we have this idea of the Babylonians punishing the nations also in Jeremiah. Okay. Here as well in Jeremiah. So it could be understood this way as well, that verse 8 is about the Babylonian conquests. And this makes sense, and this seems to be how the people who put together the order understood it, as we discussed at the Book of the 12th. But also, Zephaniah is living in a time just before the invasion of Babylon. So from a historical perspective of when he lived, that would make sense as well. So two possible interpretations, the Muslim conquests or the Babylonian conquests. Okay, that's verse 8. That's section 1. Now, verses 9 to 10, the Gentiles convert and begin to worship the one God. So notice here there's a time jump, right? We've gone from the nations being punished to now them worshiping the one God. At that time, I will change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord. From beyond the rivers of Kush, my supplicants, my scattered ones, shall bring my offerings. Okay? So again, looking at the Hebrew for this, when it says that God will give them purified lips, this can be understood as talking about purified lips, or can be understood to be speaking about a pure language. God is going to give them a pure language. And then the material about what they've translated as one accord, the Hebrew literally says one shoulder. They're going to worship God with one shoulder. And that many have understood to mean shoulder to shoulder, that they're going to worship together shoulder to shoulder, okay? And others just understanding it generally about unity. So, for example, the NIV translation says, then I will purify the lips of the people, etc., so that they may serve him shoulder to shoulder. Whereas the Revised JPS says, for then I will make the peoples pure of speech, and then in the footnote they say, I will make the peoples pure of speech, thus reversing the primeval confounding of speech in Babel, meaning in the story in Genesis 11, all the people speak one language, okay, and then God changes their language to multiple language. So they're saying this is, Zephaniah is predicting a reversal of this. They're going to go back to speaking one language, okay, so that they all invoke God by name and render services with one accord. The Targum certainly understands it as meaning God is going to change their language, okay, to one language. And many rabbis understand it this way as well. All right. The Oxford Handbook of the Minor Prophets, which we looked at under Zephaniah, they say, stating that at that time the Lord will change the speech of the nations to call on his name and serve him, reminiscent of Genesis 11. So again, they're saying it's a reversal of the story in Genesis 11, where the people have one language and then they end up in the end, at the end, having multiple languages. The idea here is it's going to be a reversal of that. They're going to go back to having one language. Okay. The New Oxford Annotated Bible takes the same interpretation of that it's a change of language. They say the punishment of those who built the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11:9 is reversed. Marvin Sweeney says the same thing, that it's connected clearly to Genesis 11 and it's about a change of language. Okay. There's actually something I'm trying to see. Is it here or later? Okay, it might be later. Anyway, so in the Anchor Bible commentary on Zephaniah, they mention that Zephaniah actually has a lot of links to Genesis 1 through 11. 3 links they give. They say, themes from the early chapters of Genesis appear in all 3 chapters of Zephaniah. Chapter 1 begins with a description that is a reversal of creation. Okay. Chapter 2 plays on the view of the world in Genesis 10. And then they say chapter 3 contains a hint of a reference to Genesis 11 in the phrase, I will turn over the people pure speech. So we know Zephaniah is playing with Genesis. So that bolsters that interpretation. Again, another interpretation is that they're going to get purified lips, so they're going to stop calling upon false gods and they're going to start calling upon the one God. And of course, both of these interpretations fit Islam, because Islam, when it came, the nations converted to monotheism, and of course, they pray in Arabic. So the idea of purified lips, we have something like that in Isaiah, where Isaiah is expressing, I'm a man of unclean lips, I live among a people of unclean lips, etc. So now they're going to get pure lips. And Isaiah is speaking about a spiritual condition here. Okay, so they're going to get a pure language, right? It seems to be playing with Genesis 11. The Quran says, or Allah says in the Quran, وَلَقَدْ نَعْلَمُ أَنَّهُمْ يَقُولُونَ إِنَّمَا يُعَلِّمُهُ بَشَرٌ لِسَانُ الَّذِي يُلْهِدُونَ إِلَيْهِ أَعْجَمِيٌّ وَهَذَا لِسَانٌ عَرَبِيٌّ مُبِينٌ. And we certainly know that they say it is only a human being who teaches them. The tongue of the one they refer to is foreign, and this is in a clear Arabic tongue. And of course, we know Arabic spread throughout the Islamic Empire, being the lingua franca there. Now, someone may object. They may say that when Islam came, the world didn't fully convert to one language. Other languages still existed. Yes, Arabic became very popular, but other languages still exist. So there hasn't been a full switch to one language like we have in Genesis 11. In response, I would say, well, first of all, remember that Zephaniah is connected, the language change, to prayer. So it's supposed to be connected to prayer. And all Muslims pray in the same language in Arabic. Okay? So, again, if we read the verse in Zephaniah, for then I will turn to the people a pure language, that they may call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one shoulder. So why is the language coming? For prayer reasons. Okay? The purpose of the change of the language is so they may call upon the name of the Lord, and all Muslims pray in Arabic. No Muslim prays in a different language. That's the first point. Second point, in Zephaniah 1, there's a reversal of the imagery in Genesis chapter 1, but it's not literal. It's not a literal reversal of Genesis 1. It's not on the same scale. It's just using the imagery of Genesis 1. It's reversing the imagery of Genesis 1 to express an idea, the idea of judgment. Similarly, Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9, it's reversing the imagery of Genesis 11. It doesn't need to literally go back to the whole world has one language like in Genesis 11. It doesn't need to be on the same scale or a literal full reversal of Genesis chapter 11. Rather, it can just be using the imagery of Genesis 11 being reversed to convey a point. So if you didn't understand that, let me again point out that, as this commentary mentions, and if you just read the beginning of Zephaniah, you'll see this, uh, themes from the early chapters of Genesis appear in all three chapters of Zephaniah. Chapter 1 begins with a description that is the reversal of creation. Human beings, animals, birds of the sky, fish of the sea, and indeed creation is being reversed. The created world is about to be destroyed. The phrase everything from upon the surface of the earth reinforces the association with the stories of creation, expulsion from Eden, and the flood. Yet Zephaniah is not literally speaking about the reversal of creation. He's just using that imagery. He's reversing Genesis 1 as imagery to convey a point, but he's not literally saying that creation is going to be undone. He's just describing the situation of the people. Okay, describing the situation of judgment. Okay, through the sort of this idea, language of Genesis 1 being reversed. So in the same way, when Zephaniah chapter 3 reverses the imagery and language of Genesis 11, it doesn't need to literally happen in that way or on that scale. Rather, it can just be that Zephaniah is using this imagery of Genesis 11 being reversed to convey the point that the people are going to pray in the one language of Arabic. Okay? I'm going to say that one last time. Zephaniah 1 is about uh, a military conquest, and that's described through the imagery of Genesis 1 being reversed. But it's not literally Genesis 1 being reversed. Similarly, Zephaniah 3 is about the nations praying in Arabic, in the one language of Arabic, and it's expressed through this imagery of Genesis 11 being reversed. But it's not literally, it doesn't need to literally happen in a way that Genesis 11 is fully reversed or on the same scale. Okay. With that done, now again, we'll look again at the next part of verse 9, which says that they shall serve him with one shoulder, and this has been interpreted as meaning serve him shoulder to shoulder, or some say with one accord, right? Unity, that's the idea. Now, the phrase with one shoulder, according to many scholars, it comes from this idea of animals being yoked together. Okay, so for example, J.J.M. Roberts says the phrase with one shoulder is an idiomatic expression derived from the realm of the draft animals, which were yoked together and with their shoulders share the weight of their common work. And the International Critical Commentary says the same thing. It probably rests upon the fact that oxen were joined together by one yoke. Okay, now this scholar, he thinks it's not derived from that, but it's more likely derived from jointly carrying a burden. But it's it's a similar idea. Okay. Uh, okay. Again, this scholar has taken it as being about unity, I think. Okay. Anyway, so this is what it looks like when oxen are yoked together. Okay. And many scholars think this is what the idea of one shoulder is taken from. And look at how the Muslims pray. You can see the resemblance, shoulder to shoulder, as if they have one shoulder. Okay, this is Muslim prayer, standing shoulder to shoulder. Right? It's as if they have one shoulder. The Prophet, peace be upon him, he said that straighten your rows, for I see you from behind my back. And Anas, he added, every one of us used to put his shoulder with the shoulder of his companion and his foot with the foot of his companion. So that's how the Muslims pray. It's as if it's one shoulder. And when the Imam says takbir, everyone says takbir. When he stands, everyone is standing. When he bows, then everyone bows too. They bow together. And then they're bowing together. Then he rises up and everyone rises up following him. Right? And then he prostrates, everyone prostrates following him. So it's as if they're all praying as one person. Right? It's as if they're all praying as one person because they're praying together in this way. And they're doing their movements together, following the Imam. The Imam goes down, then everyone follows him going down, etc. So it's as if they're one body. It's as if they're one shoulder. So the Muslims pray united as one body. We also pray in a pure Arabic language. And in prayer, we renounce false gods and only worship the one true God. Okay. As the Prophet said, peace be upon him, you see the believers As regards their being merciful among themselves and showing love among themselves and being kind, resembling one body, so that if any part of the body is not well, then the whole body shares the sleeplessness and fever within it. So this is just generally speaking about the condition of the Muslims. They're as if they're one body. Okay. And in Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem especially, different Muslims come from all over the world to pray together, and they stand shoulder to shoulder together. So there are these Gentiles from all these different nations coming specifically together to pray together, shoulder to shoulder, in the same language all together. So that's what Zephaniah says, right? The nations are going to have this change of language, and they're going to serve God as if they have one shoulder. And you can see this is what we say in prayer. We say other things as well, but this is what we say. What are the things we say when we're standing? And this is the Arabic. This is what everyone says. And this is a translation, but you don't say the translation when you're praying. You say the Arabic. And you can see it is a pure speech. It's a pure Arabic language, but also remember we discussed the other understanding of pure lips, that Gentiles are gonna move away from idolatry, praising their false gods, and going to start praising the one God. So what the Muslims say in prayer nicely matches that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen ar-Rahman ar-Rahim Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. All praise and thanks is due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful, owner of the day of recompense. It is you we worship, and you we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those upon whom you have bestowed favor, not of those who have invoked anger or of those who went astray. Okay. So that should be enough for verse 9. Let's look at verse 10 now. From beyond the rivers of Kush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. Okay. So the New American Commentary says that Kush, what does Kush refer to? It refers to the area of the Upper Nile, including the area of the Sudan and part of Ethiopia. Okay. Carol Dempsey, in the New Collegeville Commentary, understands that it's Gentiles from beyond the rivers of Kush that are bringing these gifts to God. Okay, so they say the foreign countries will be given pure lips so that they can all worship Israel's God and bring gifts to this God as well. So who's bringing the gifts? It's Gentiles. Marvin Sweeney argues this as well, because there are other scholars who say it's Jews who have been exiled that are coming from there and bringing gifts. But other scholars say, no, it's the Gentiles there that are coming and bringing these gifts. And Marvin Sweeney argues for this. And he uses the context to support him, because verse 9 is clearly about the Gentiles. So he says, verse 9 is about the Gentiles, so you would expect verse 10 is about the Gentiles as well. So he's arguing from the context, and then he also says that there are links between Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 9 to 10, and Isaiah chapter 18 and 19, which are about Ethiopians and / Egyptians worshiping God. So he says that also points to the fact that the Gentiles are the ones who are bringing the offerings. And then another point to be made is that the language of scattered people, this can refer to Israel being scattered, but it's also actually used in Genesis 11. The very story of Babel, which many scholars believe Zephaniah is reversing, right? We discussed that Genesis 11, the story where one language and then they end up with multiple languages. That story also describes the people as scattered, right? The same word is used, so that would also indicate that the Gentiles are the ones who are being described in Zephaniah when it talks about my worshippers, my scattered ones from beyond Kush are going to bring me offerings. Okay, because the same word for scattered is used, and that is mentioned, for example, here by this commentary. not only so both Zephaniah 3:9 and 3:10 evoke the language of Gen 11. Not only does Zephaniah envision the return of humanity to a state of common language, but it also uses the same word to describe the scattering of humans, as does Genesis 11:4 and 8. Okay. Now, who are the people that are coming from beyond the rivers of Kush? Uh, Again, Kush is understood to be the area of the Upper Nile, including the area of Sudan and a part of Ethiopia. Marvin Sweeney says it's a reference to either the Ethiopians or the Egyptians. Okay, so he says here, nevertheless, the intertextual relationship between Zeph 3:9 to 10 and Isaiah 18 to 19, and the general focus on the nations in Zeph 3:8b to 10, points to the use of the term in reference to the nations who will recognize the Lord, specifically Egypt or the lands beyond the rivers of Cush. Because this verse points to an understanding that Isaiah 18 to 19 are fulfilled, the supplicants must be from Egypt or Ethiopia. So it's either Egyptians or Ethiopians. And many will say it's the Ethiopians that are being spoken about. That seems to be the majority opinion. So the rivers of Ethiopia are generally taken to be the Nile. So this is the White Nile, and then this is the Blue Nile, as you can see, and it's understood. So the stuff beyond these rivers, this sort of land here. And you can see that can include Somalia. You can say this is beyond those rivers. Ethiopia, South Sudan, a little bit of Sudan here. You could, this sort of stuff. Seems to be the idea. And of course, there are Muslims in these areas. As you can see here, this is a map of the Muslim population. Somalia, for example, you see majority Muslim, and then there's a significant Muslim population in Ethiopia and these sorts of lands. So there are Muslims who come to God from these lands offering gifts. Okay, actually, some of the very first converts to Islam were Ethiopians, and there's a ayah about them in the Quran, or actually more than one. There's a passage in the Quran about them. وَإِذَا سَمِعُوا مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَى الرَّسُولِ تَرَى أَعْيُنُهُمْ تَفِيضُ مِنَ الدَّمْعِ مِمَّا عَرَفُوا مِنَ الْحَقِّ يَقُولُونَ رَبَّنَا آمَنَّا فَاكْتُبْنَا مَعَ الشَّاهِدِينَ. Talking about how they believe in Islam when they hear about it. Okay, when they hear the Quran, they believe in it. Okay, these people who were those people from Abyssinia who converted to Islam, and it's understood to be Najashi, who was the leader of the kingdom that was in Ethiopia. The king, he converted to Islam, and then also the delegation that he sent to the Prophet, peace be upon him, they converted to Islam as well. Muqattil bin Sulaiman mentions this, Labari mentions this, So this is the classical interpretation. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, actually prayed for the king of that land, the ruler of Ethiopia, Najashi, because he had become a Muslim. So this is sort of that kingdom, it seems to be, that Najashi was a king over. And you can say this is beyond the Nile rivers. Right? The blue and the white Nile, you see it encompasses some of that area. Now, the word that they'll bring offerings, the word there just means either sacrifices or tribute or gifts. As you can see here, Isaiah 18, the word is actually present. Okay, here you can see it can be used for offerings. Anyway, Ibn Uthaymeen mentions that the hadi, the sacrificial hadi, which is sacrificial animals that Muslims bring to Hajj, that they resemble a gift to a beloved person. And Nawawi actually says that it is favorable that a person should bring his hadi with him from his homeland. So he should bring the sacrificial animals from his homeland to Hajj. And of course, the idea of gifts being given to God can also encompass the idea of gifts from God can also encompass just stuff like charity, right? Like when Muslims will go to Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, etc., they will often bring charity so that they can give it there, to the people there and whatnot. As we know, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "Do not set out on a journey except for 3 mosques," meaning the mosque in Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Right. So uh, Muslims go to the Temple Mount, as well as going to Mecca and Medina and this and that. So Isaiah 18 specifically is actually about going to Jerusalem, whereas Zephaniah does not actually specifically tell you where they're going. Okay, but whichever place they're going, Jerusalem, Mecca, Medina, they all work, because Jerusalem is still holy in Islam. Okay, verse 11. On that day, you shall not be put to shame because of all the deeds by which you have rebelled against me. For then I will remove from your midst your proudly exultant ones. And you shall no longer be haughty in my holy mountain. Actually, from verse 11 onwards, so this continues until verse 13, and then verse 14 begins a new section, but it's on the same topic. The topic is basically now Israel's redemption. Okay, Judah's redemption, Jerusalem's redemption, and this and that. But, so in my interpretation, this is actually referring to the Messianic era. So this is supposed to be future in the Messianic era. Okay, so verse 8, I said, is either the Islamic conquests or the Babylonian conquests. Then verse 9, there's a jump in time to now the nations have converted to Islam. Verses 9 to 10. Verse 11, I'm saying, is another jump in time to now speaking about the Messianic era when, according to the Bible, Israel will be saved again. And even Islam says that there's not going to be anyone from the people of the book except that they're going to believe in Jesus before Jesus dies. Okay? So basically, all the surviving Jews and Christians are going to become Muslims before Jesus dies. Okay. So, again, the interpretation we took is that when it talks about people beyond Ethiopia, my scattered ones, we said these are Gentiles coming because of the context of verse 9, which is the Gentiles worshiping God. So then verses 8 to 10 are specifically clearly about the Gentiles, and verse 9 is a jump in time, but still about the Gentiles, verses 8 to 10. But then verse 11 onwards, now we have a shift in topic. Now we're speaking about Judah and Israel and Jerusalem and this and that. So there's a shift in topic, so it makes sense that there's a shift in time as well. Just like verse 8 to 9, there's a shift, even though the subject is still Gentiles, but there's a shift from punishment on the Gentiles to now the saving of Gentiles. Now they all worship God. So similarly, there's a jump in topic in verse 11, so it can be fulfilled at a later time. And actually, if you recall, in the beginning of the stream, we looked at chapter 2 of Zephaniah. I believe it was something like verse 11, which says, they're going to be punished, and then the Gentiles are going to be punished, then they're going to start worshiping God. But how's that going to happen? Again, it's going to happen with a jump in time, obviously, because they're not going to be punished and convert to worshiping one God at the same time. There has to be a jump in time there. So I'm saying because there's a jump in topic now from the Gentiles to Israel, Judah, etc., this can be a reference to later times, and I think it's a reference to the Messianic times. As Marvin Sweeney says, the reference in verse 11 to that day relates to the day when the Lord will arise, mentioned in chapter 3, verse 8. Thus, verse 11 takes up the Lord's projected plans for Jerusalem and the remnant of Israel once actions against the nations are completed. So verse 11 is now speaking about God's plans for Jerusalem and for the remnant of Israel when God's plans with the Gentiles are finished. And actually, if you read verse 11 onwards, it's not about all the Israelites, it's specifically about a remnant within them. So again, I'm claiming that, as Marvin Sweeney says, verse 11 is now a shift in topic from the Gentiles to the Israelites, so it's a shift in time as well. Actually, taking verse 11 to begin a different section is how the New English Bible treats it. You can see they start a new section in verse 11 to now be about the remnant of Israel. And the Oxford Handbook of the Minor Prophets under Zephaniah, they say that this section in verses 18 to 13 can actually be subdivided, or actually verse 8 to 20 can be subdivided into 4 subsections. Verse 8 starting one subsection, verse 9 starting another subsection, verse 11 starting another subsection, and then verse 14 starting another subsection. So I am saying that verse 8, 9, and 11 are three different subsections to be fulfilled in three different times. Okay. And again, the phrase "on that day," which begins verse 11, "On that day you will not be put to shame," etc. This often indicates a jump in time. It's often a transition phrase. Okay, sometimes, for example, in Isaiah 19, actually, which is interesting because we saw that Zephaniah chapter 3 might actually be interacting with Isaiah 18 to 19. In Isaiah 19, interestingly, "on that day" actually means after that time often, and I'll show you that. The phrase also just sometimes mean a switch from punishment to a later time when salvation is going to come, and it could also be used to refer to the Messianic time. So on that day, meaning the Messianic times. Okay, so we'll look at that here of the phrase being used in that way. So here's Isaiah 19. If you look at verse 16, it says, "On that day, the Egyptians will be like women. They're going to be tremble in fear and this and that." So that's punishment on the Egyptians. Yet verse 18 says, "On that day, there'll be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that are going to swear allegiance to God." Okay, so we've gone from punishment to some nice stuff about Egypt, some positivity, and then verse 19, it says, "On that day, there's going to be an altar in the midst of Egypt, etc." And then it says, verse 21, "The Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians will know the Lord on that day." So we've gone from punishment on Egypt to 5 cities in Egypt have begun to worship God, to now the Egyptians in general. So obviously there's a switch here, right? There are switches in time here. That's why many commentaries will tell you in Isaiah 19, often "on that day" actually means after that time. We can also see Zephaniah. So this is a commentary on Zephaniah by Marvin Sweeney, and he says, if this will ever load, which it might not. Okay. So he says that. Actually, we don't need this. Okay, so here we have Amos. So if you look at Amos verses 8 to 10, we have a lot of punishment. And then verse 11, "On that day I will raise up." Oh, what happened there? Oops. Okay, what happened is that the presentation has frozen, so I'm going to try and restart that. I'll be back in a minute. Try to restart this presentation. Tried to take care of some background noise there as well, if you guys heard that. Let's see. Okay. So again, we saw. Okay, so verse 11. "On that day I will raise up the booth of David." Oh, actually, I didn't add it to screen. Okay, Amos. "On that day I will raise up the booth of David that's fallen." So here it's a switch to Messianic times. So we've gone from punishment to now a switch to Messianic times. Ezekiel 29 is also similar. We go from punishment to now verse 21. "On that day I will cause a horn to sprout up for the house of Israel," and so on. So we now switch to the Messianic times. So similarly, I'm saying that the "on that day" in Zephaniah chapter 11, on that day, this represents a switch to Messianic times. Okay. So Zechariah 2 is interesting. It first talks about like Babylon, like come back from Babylon, the exiles coming back from Babylon, and then verse 11, "Many nations shall join themselves to the Lord on that day and shall be my people." Of course, this has to be after that time, significantly after that time, because um, the return from Babylon didn't instantly result in the Gentiles converting and worshiping the one God. That happened after Islam came. So there has to be a big jump there. Isaiah 13 is similar. Verses 18 to chapter 4, verse 1 describe a lot of punishment. And in verse 2, on that day the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious in this and that. So again, we have a switch in time. So the phrase on that day can often be a transitional phrase to now take us to a different time. And that's what I'm claiming is going on there. Okay. And remember, between verses 8 to 9, there's an obvious jump because we've gone from punishment to on the Gentiles to positivity on the Gentiles. So it would make sense that verse 11 is also a different time, which is also indicated by reading the phrase on that day as a transitional phrase, as it often acts. And that's pretty much it. I will field any questions at this point, and I might also summarize. So to summarize, we had verse 8, which we said are the Islamic conquests on the Gentiles, or perhaps the Babylonian conquests. Verse 9, we said, verses 9 to 10 are the key verses, speaking about how the Gentiles are going to be changed to a different language, yes, and they're going to use that language to call upon God, which the Muslims do when they pray to God in Arabic, and all the Muslims pray in Arabic, and they serve him with one shoulder, which is the Muslims in congregational prayer. They pray as if they're one body, right? And they stand in the rows, they stand shoulder to shoulder, right? So it's as if they have one shoulder. When the Imam bows, they all follow him. When he stands up, they all follow him, and they stand together and whatnot. So it's as if it's one body. It's as if it's one shoulder, right? And if you want to take the idea that it's a bit of a more metaphorical idea, that it's as if everyone has like this burden that they're carrying, but it's like all these people have come together to carry like this burden with one shoulder. You can say that's similar to congregational prayer as well, which is worship being done all together, all the people coming together to worship together. Okay. And then verse 11, we said from here on, it's describing the Messianic times. And I don't think there are actually any questions in the chat. So, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, seeing as I don't see any questions, we'll just end it there. Okay, unless we get one or two. I don't think so. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. I'm actually going to check one thing before I close it. Just want to look at the Hebrew of something. Yeah, okay. Okay.